but I think we can start. So first, just a kind of few words about the Daly Lecture. So the Reginald Daly Lecture honors the life and work of the Canadian geologist Reginald Daly. It is presented annually to a recipient who exemplifies Daly's work with outstanding contributions to volcanology, geochemistry, or petrology. Professor Christy B from Arizona State University receives the Daly Lecture 2024 for her outstanding accomplishments in volcanology and petrology, and for her contribution to a positive and healthy research culture. Christy's research achievements span a large range of disciplines and have tackled the most fundamental of questions. She's made groundbreaking contributions in quantifying magma fluxes and understanding eruption triggers and timescales, both in subduction zones and supervolcanoes such as Yellowstone. She's made important contribution to understanding mantle melting in a range of contexts, including hydrous flux melting in arcs and magma genesis on other planets. So Christy is an exemplar for how to conduct research in an open and inclusive way, and she also excels in science communication. For all these reasons, she's a well-deserving recipient of the Daly Lecture 2024, and we are honored today to listen to her talk on approaches for the next generation of questions in ichnopetrology. So I now ask Christy to come on stage to receive the awards before we can listen to her. We have our Thank you. I'll leave this one here for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you some insights in how we can start to tackle our next generation of questions in igneous petrology. But before I get into the science, I'd like to start with my acknowledgement for fear if I leave them to the end, I'll get too emotional. So for those of you who don't know, my research group is called the Experimental Petrology and Igneous Processes Center, or EPIC for short. The second P is silent. And I've certainly been on an epic journey in my career thus far. And like all recognitions in our community, this one really belongs to the group of amazing people that I've gotten to work with and who have supported me throughout my career, many of whom you can see here. So I'd like to extend this award to all of them and hope that you'll remember them throughout the course of the work that I'll be sharing with you today. So to get into the science, we have a great many important questions that we need to still tackle in volcano science today, and I'm showing just two of those here. The first, how do transcrustal processes initiate eruptions at arc volcanoes, is from the SC4D implementation plan. And the second, what drives volcanism, is from the National Academies of Sciences Earth and Time report. And these questions are emblematic of many in our communities right now, in that they focus on processes and ask questions about the drivers of those processes. And as we start to tackle these questions, one of the tools at our disposal is the many ways that we compare and contrast volcanoes. And I'm showing two of the most common ways that we classify and can compare volcanoes right now. And you can see that they're largely based on volcano morphology and eruption style. And while these classification schemes have been really important and led to a great deal of insights over the last 50 plus years, they do provide some limitations in how we think about answering those frontier questions, especially in terms of thinking about deeper processes and their drivers. So I'd like to begin with the question today: how can we better compare and contrast volcanic systems to answer our frontier research questions? And there is no better place to start as we attempt to answer these questions than to look to some of our other fields where they have to compare and contrast other complex bits of information. So a first comparison we might look to is our colleagues in the fields of evolutionary biology, linguistics, and psychology, who use primarily statistical clustering techniques, originally called cladistics. now you might know it as hierarchical cluster analysis, to group entities by numbers of shared traits. And that has now evolved into what we call phylogenetic trees, an example of which I'm showing here. And this has been very important, led to so many discoveries like natural selection and evolution. And so it provides one important comparison point for us as we think about how we might compare and contrast volcanic systems. We can look to another example from our medical insurance colleagues who create what we call networks of causal influences. So here we're looking at the events contributing to water and energy shortages and food shortages. And they create a sort of tree of possibilities or potential influences. And one might assign probabilities to these relationships, as one does in the event trees that we see in common use at volcano observatories during active volcanic events. And these are also very similar to the Bayesian networks that we use for Bayesian inference. So it provides another data point that we can use to think about how we compare and contrast volcanic systems. So I would like to borrow aspects of both of these and propose that we start to think about comparing and contrasting volcanic systems through a process-based framework. So here I'm showing the example of the beautiful high magnesian andesite from Mount Shasta. You can see its eruptive deposit there on the left. And one framework with which we can begin to think about classifying this system is by asking the question, what processes formed this igneous rock unit? And to answer that question, we would begin with the processes starting deep in the mantle, the questions about what processes generated the parental melts, move into thinking about the processes that control that transport of the melt through the mantle and how they may or may not change the melt en route, what processes happened within the lithosphere and crust to evolve this melt and differentiate it? Was there mixing involved? And finally, what initiated the eruption of this particular igneous rock unit? And we can organize these questions into a tree-based framework, what I'd like to call a magmatic tree, where we create a graphical representation of the different processes that formed this igneous rock unit, starting with the mantle melting mechanism on the bottom and continuing all the way up to the eruption initiation mechanism on the top. And this decision tree structure allows us to have a basic structure that is for all comparison of all igneous rock units. We can add complexity to it depending on the data available, add other levels to the tree, for example. And there's a rough spatial distribution of the mantle melting on the bottom and eruption initiation on the top, but we recognize that many of these processes are occurring at the same location and concurrently, and so it is not a spatial-based decision tree. And there's perhaps no better way to illustrate how a tree like this might work than working through an example. So I'd like to work through the example of creating the tree for the Mount Shasta high magnesian andesite, which also provides a nice retrospective of some of the work I've done over my career thus far. So we'll start with the mantle melting mechanism. During my PhD, I did a great deal of experiments trying to understand how the mantle melts in the context of the subduction zone, so peridotite melting in the presence of large amounts of water. And we created the phase diagram that you can see here, where we're looking at mantle melting of peridotite near the water-saturated solidus. And the high magnesian andesite is a very nice example of one of the melts that's generated in an experiment like this and is a product of flux melting. So we'll select the flux melting as the first node in our magmatic tree. I went on to do a great deal of work on mantle thermobarometry, so trying to understand what were the conditions recorded by our least evolved melts and where they were extracted from the mantle. And in the context of subduction zones, the high magnesian andesite is another beautiful example of showing how, although it was generated close to the water-saturated solidus, it re-equilibrated as it rose through the mantle wedge and records final extraction conditions from near the base of the arc lithosphere. And so we'll select the reactive porous flow node as the next one on our tree. A former master's students, Mitchell Phillips and I, also worked on understanding the crustal evolution of the high magnesian andesite. And here I'm showing a phase diagram from Mike Krasinski and colleagues for the high magnesian andesite. And this, along with inferences from thermobarometry, indicate that this magma crystallized in the mid-crust around 500 MPa in about 975 to 1,000 degrees Celsius. And this is indicative of selecting the crystallization node on our magmatic tree. This rock also has multiple populations of pyroxene, both orthopyroxene and clinopyroxene, with different composition cores and complexly zoned rims that are indicative of mixing of more and less evolved batches of the magma. And we conducted diffusion chronometry on these rims. And this shows that this mixing event occurred in the mid-crust approximately 3 years before final eruption of the magma. And so we can select the magma mixing node on this tree with arrows to indicate that this was concurrent with crystallization. And we can also indicate some of the conditions under which this mixing was occurring, as well as indicate the time scales for the remainder of the processes on the tree there at the top. And finally, recently, Adam Kent, Carrie Cooper, and I published a paper recently where we asked the question, what are the internal mechanisms that initiate the ascent and final eruption of magmas that we can extract evidence for from the petrologic and geochemical record? And we determined there were 4 main internal processes, 3 of which have to do with mixing, and they are named by the composition of the mixing liquids. So mafic magmas mixing with mafic magmas causes mafic rejuvenation. Silicic magmas mixing with silicic magma causes felsic rejuvenation. And finally, mafic magmas mixing with silicic magmas is what we call mafic recharge in this scheme. And finally, there's one more mechanism that can occur in a closed system as we have crystallization causing the saturation of volatiles, nucleation of bubbles, and expansion to cause volatile accumulation, building overpressure for eruption, sometimes also known as second boiling. And of these 4 mechanisms, the high magnesium andesite is consistent with the mafic rejuvenation as its eruption initiation mechanism. So we've selected that on the top node of the tree here. So we can see we've constructed a basic tree for how the many processes that contributed to forming the high magnesium andesite at Mount Shasta. And this was based on the body of work that I just mentioned. But there's another set of papers by Streck and Lehman that have an alternative interpretation for how this rock was formed that has to do with crustal melts mixing with xenocryst from the Trinity peridotite and a calc-alkaline basalt. And they run a mixing model that shows the proportions that you can see in the numerical values there. And so quickly, you have a nice snapshot graphic of 2 sets of interpretations regarding the origins of this rock. And even if you don't completely understand each of the nodes, you can visually just see that there are differences easily from this. And so it provides a way for us to sort of have a quick snapshot of the different body of work that's been done petrologically and geochemically on an individual rock. You also note that the Streck and Lehman study does not identify mantle melting mechanisms or mantle transport mechanisms, and so those nodes are not selected. So it also provides us a way to understand where there are gaps in our understanding for a particular igneous rock unit. And I'm sure that the many people in this room can identify with the fact that we all collect different kinds of data on volcanic systems these days. And that's tremendously powerful, but it can also make communication between us more challenging. And so magmatic trees provide a mechanism to translate results as our myriads of different kinds of data all speak to a common set of underlying processes. And by illustrating these graphically and identifying those processes, it provides a mechanism for us to communicate easily across our many disciplines and really conduct that type of interdisciplinary science that we all are aiming for. And finally, as teachers, scaffolds such as this have been shown to increase student learning, problem solving, and hypothesis testing. So in a forthcoming paper, I include a worksheet that teaches students how to identify magmatic processes and build magmatic trees. And I use this in teaching igneous petrology. I'm happy to share if anybody else is interested. So I've talked a little bit about some ways that we can compare and contrast magmatic systems. And I would like to apply this technique of magmatic trees to understanding more about the Cascades arc and what we can learn from applying magmatic trees to the patterns of magmatism in the Cascades arc. Think a little bit about possible drivers for those patterns, and then think a little bit about an underexplored equity issue, which is how we give feedback in the remainder of the talk. So here I'm showing you another magmatic tree. This slide is set up in a way that I'll show several slides. So to orient you, we have the magmatic tree in the middle. We have information about the rock types for which it describes at the top. We have a map in the top right-hand corner with an arrow indicating the specific cascade system that we're thinking about. And on the bottom left, the studies with which the magmatic tree is based. So here we're looking at the tree for the Mount Rainier calc-alkaline hybrid andesites that erupted since the construction of the modern Mount Rainier edifice starting around 500,000 years ago. And in this particular set of studies, Tom Sisson and colleagues have identified that there's an important contribution for crustal melting, both from antecedent intrusions, which you can see in the middle of the third level up there, and on the far left, Eocene Puget group sediments melting and contributing. And this combination of crustal melts contributes between 30 to 50% of the erupted magmas, along with crystallization of a hydrous parent magma. And that mixes together and produces the final eruption through mafic recharge. So we can see that there's an important role for crustal melting identified here through the Mount Rainier system. Here we're looking at another tree generated off of the study of Mandler et al. On the Tuff of Newberry caldera. This was the cataclysmic eruption that formed the modern caldera at Newberry volcano. And here you might notice that I have reproduced the crystallization, crustal melting, and magma mixing levels of the tree to indicate the sort of evolution of the system with different processes identified occurring in the lower crust or above 5 kilobars, different from those that are occurring in the upper crust at less than 5 kilobars. So in this evolution of this particular rock, it's inferred that, in this case, dry decompression melts provided the heat to melt antecedent intrusions in the area that had a granitic protolith to produce crustal melts that mixed with these dry decompression melts and produced a damp parental melt that then went on to crystallize in isolation in the upper crust and accumulate volatiles to produce the eruption of the Tuff of Newberry caldera. So this two system, although the players are different and it's at perhaps a different location in the crust, also indicates an important role for crustal melting in forming the Tuff of Newberry caldera. So these examples are not unique. If we start to build magmatic trees for units across the many systems and the cascades arc, one of the common threads that we see, as highlighted by the green boxes, is that many, many units have interpreted roles for crustal melts in their origin and evolution. And these trees represent many different time periods across the construction of the modern Cascades edifices and different compositions of rocks. And so this is not unique to a particular time period or composition that we see this contribution from crustal melting. And this is actually not that surprising. If you look at this the seminal body of work that came out by Danica Blatter, Tom Sisson, and the late Ben Hankins in recent years, they showed in 2013 that you cannot produce the majority of cascade arc magmas through progressive crystallization alone. And then in 2017, they showed that melting of intrusions containing amphibole are conducive to generating the likely mixing component that we see in arc magmas. And then in 2023 showed that crystallization in the lower crust alone still cannot produce the diversity of arc magmatic compositions. So this is illustrated by the plot on the bottom, where we have the alumina silica index on the y-axis plotted against silica content on the x-axis. And the color contours show a body of close to 6,000 arc geochemical compositions from across the globe. And then in gray, we show the experimental crystallization trends that are produced for the variety of experiments that are both done by Blatter and colleagues and in other studies that are referenced in their papers. And what you can see is that the experimental crystallization trends quickly go up into the space that we call paraluminous space and indicate much higher paraluminosity than the average arc magmas, which are showed in the densest regions in those reds and oranges in the middle of the plot. And rather they interpret that the circle on the far left, which is a typical Mount Rainier hydrous basalt, and a melt of an antecedent intrusion that contained amphibole, such as the Mount St. Helens YN dacite, which is indicated by the green square, are the likely mixing components that form the majority of arc magmas. So this is consistent with that role of crustal melting that I was mentioning in the prevalence of the magmatic trees. So one of the patterns that emerges from constructing magmatic trees, along with these other studies, is that we see melting of older intrusions and or basement is prevalent in the construction of our modern cascade edifices. Another way we can use magmatic trees is by combining multiple eruptive episodes onto the same tree to create a sort of probabilistic event tree for deep mantle and crustal igneous processes. So here I'm showing the 4 time periods that produced lavas at Mount Hood since 20,000 years ago. And in all of these time periods of these 4, they all experienced magma mixing between the same components, this crustal melt mixed with a crystallized product of a hydrous basalt. And they all experienced mafic recharge as the eruption initiation mechanism. So it stands that we've seen the last 20,000 years produce the same products through the same processes over and over again at Mount Hood. And therefore, if we were to think about what would be likely to happen if Mount Hood were to kick into activity again, there's a high probability that we would see the same set of processes repeat. This is in contrast to if we look at neighboring Mount St. Helens. And when we map a similar set of eruption periods onto a single magmatic tree and calculate their probabilities sort of retroactively looking backwards, we see that there's a much greater diversity of processes at the top of the tree. So each individual one has a lower probability in contrast to those processes at Mount Hood. And an important question, I think, then follows why? What is the difference between Mount Hood, which is only a few kilometers away, and Mount St. Helens, such that they're in the same subduction zone, and yet they're experiencing different sets of processes over the same time periods with different probabilities? So let's think about some of the possible drivers that be causing these differences. One important one is to consider time. So here we're plotting up the duration of magmatic activity at the various main cascade central edifices. And where the older bars there over on the left indicate the oldest period of volcanism at the location. And then the volcano icon shows us when we began to construct the modern cascade edifice of that name. So we can see, for example, that Mount Hood and Mount Rainier both began construction about 1.5 million years ago. And the modern edifice began construction around 500,000 years ago. And if we look at both of these sets of systems and their typical magmatic trees, as I did at Mount Hood, they both have a very similar set of common magmatic processes that occur over and over again, and that their dominant eruptive product is andesite greater than dacite. Now, if we look at Mount Shasta, Mount Adams, and Mount Baker, these systems all sort of established activity around 500,000 years ago. In the case of Mount Baker, there was some older activity before the modern edifice construction, but edifice construction beginning around that time for Adams and Shasta, they too have a common magmatic tree where we see similar processes repeated again. And in this case, it's similar to the Mount Hood and Mount Rainier trees, but it has a less important role for crustal melting. And at these volcanoes, we see andesite is by far the dominant erupted product more than all other compositions. If we look at the Middle and South Sisters and Mount Lassen, so their edifice construction began less than 500,000 years ago, but they both have activity in the southern part of the arc dating back to around 750,000 years ago. They too have common magmatic trees. In this case, we see dry decompression melts, creating those melts of the crustal and then mixing those components together. And at these systems, we see approximately equal proportions of andesite, rhyolite, and dacite mixed together. And then finally, Mount St. Helens, which is our most recently established edifice in the Cascades, has that diversity of compositions and diversity of processes that I illustrated in my last slide. And this is the only system that has a bulk composition of dacite greater than andesite in the current Cascade system. So altogether, there seems to be some rough role for the duration of volcanism and creating a string of similar processes in these systems, working over on the left from volcanoes like Mount Hood, over to the right to the shortest duration of volcanism at systems like Mount St. Helens, showing that greater diversity of processes. But that doesn't seem like perhaps the entire story. What other factors could be contributing to this particular part of understanding these strings of magmatic processes. So here I'm showing a plot that's from a paper we published in 2019 that shows the quantities of and volumes in cubic kilometers of different compositions erupted during the Quaternary in the Cascades Arc. So over on the left, on the southern side, we have Mount Lassen, and the green bars indicate the monogenetic volcanism, and then the reds and oranges indicate the compositions at the main central edifices there. And we can see there's an unequal distribution of compositions erupted up and down the Cascades, as we were just discussing, with different volumes from the south to the north. And when we can use these erupted compositions to invert back information about the mantle flux, so the volume of mantle-derived melts that were required to produce what we see erupted at the Cascades. And that includes both the amount that's lost through crystallization and intrusion, and the amount that's gained through the addition of a crustal melt to produce the final eruptive flux. So we used experimental constraints on the liquid lines of descent, as well as crustal melting, to infer how we can invert the erupted flux back to the mantle basalt flux, and came up with the curves that I'm showing here. So the volumes of mantle-derived basalt that are required for each degree of latitude are shown on the y-axis over on the right-hand side of the plot. And we can see that we have one curve if we were to form everything in the Cascades through purely crystallization, another through crustal melting, which is the lowest total amount required, and then a middle amount if we were to have a mixture of crustal melting and crystallization. So we've not broken out. As you can see, there was sort of different levels of crustal melt required for many of those edifices. Here we're assuming an average of about 60 to 40%. And we can see that there's about several thousand cubic kilometers at the most in the southern portion of the arc required per degree latitude, whereas we have much lower volumes required in the northern portion of the arc. So if we take this flux information and we include it with the time component that I was just discussing, what can we learn? So here I'm showing a paradigm model derived from the models of Caracas et al. In their 2017 paper, where they plot volume of upper crustal mush in cubic kilometers on the y-axis and time since initiation of upper crustal intrusions on the x-axis in years. And they're showing a system based on the numerical models where earlier initiated systems have a variety of fluxes and can evolve through time to having lower fluxes once they have an upper crustal intrusion sustained. And then we see this shift through time to increasing intrusive to extrusive ratios. So if we plot the variety of systems, both using the flux information as the volume proxy and the time and duration from the set of plots I showed you before, we can put our systems or types of systems on this plot with Mount St. Helens up in the top left and evolving down to the right to the more steady state systems like Mount Hood. So perhaps this combination of duration and flux are those drivers of those common sets of magmatic processes that I was showing earlier for each of these types of systems, where we see a more steady state system that's had sort of flux for a longer period of time and a more robust intrusive complex in the case of Mount Hood that might represent more of a steady state system, whereas the Mount St. Helens system has higher flux, less duration of upper crustal intrusions, and reveals this greater diversity of magmatic processes at present. We can also look to other arc systems around the world. And one thing I've started to notice is that there's systems like Mount Inden, Mount Pinatubo, that show similar patterns to what we see at Mount Hood, Mount Rainier, for example. So I think the question stands, do we see patterns of magmatic processes related to the duration of volcanism and the flux at other arc systems globally? Is this something that we can explore that is a mechanism to understand what magmatic processes are occurring and why? So far, we've learned about the role of crustal intrusions and how we might be able to use magmatic trees to understand the frequency of magmatic processes at a given volcanic center, certainly in the past and potentially even for the future. And we've talked a little bit about the types of magmatic trees that might be related to duration and flux in the Cascades. So finally, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about an underexplored equity issue. So here I'm showing some plots that are not new likely to anybody in this room, and they show what we already have known for a while now, that the earth sciences was one of the least diverse STEM fields. And we've all been working for a while now thinking about how we can change this, and we've done quite a bit of work thinking about things about how to improve the access to opportunities and bystander intervention techniques and field and workplace codes of conduct. And we still have a great deal of work to do, including in the VGP community, as we continue to strive towards changing these types of statistics. But I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about an issue that I don't think we've spent much time thinking about historically, and that is how we give feedback. And this is something that I think probably affects everybody in this room. So we all have had experiences where you can probably remember a review that made you want to cry and put your head under the covers, or maybe crumple it up and put it in the trash can and set it on fire along with saying a few expletives. And we even have a meme or two to talk about this very phenomenon, right? Reviewer number 2. Or you can probably recall back to your graduate qualifying exam. And I don't know about you, but I threw up in the bathroom before mine, and I cried in the bathroom after mine. And I bet there's a number of you who've had that feeling you can still evoke where you were so concerned about what might happen and how it might affect you during that exam. Or perhaps you've given a talk just like this, and you've had that question at the end, right? That criticized your work in a not so disguised question, or maybe it wasn't even disguised as a question at all. And you can probably still evoke that feeling inside your body that it gave you, whether it was in your qualifying exam, whether it was in a paper review, or whether it was after a talk, about how you shrunk in place and sort of vibrated with a feeling of concern when you received these harsh comments. But it doesn't have to be this way. There's actually quite a body of work on how we can give very constructive feedback in a way that does not humiliate or make people want to shy away from their work and not come back to it, or even cause them to leave the field. And I'd like to share one of those strategies with you today, and it's called the critical response process. And it was invented by a choreographer named Liz Lerman. She's a Guggenheim and MacArthur Fellow and has an incredible body of work in the dance world, but has now been adapted into a range of environments and is used in STEM fields everywhere from Yale to dance programs at the Juilliard to sustainability courses in science. And I'd like to use an example of a research group meeting as the context with which to share the construct of the critical response process with you. So imagine a research group meeting. A student has just stood up and shared their hot off the mass spec data for the first time. And they're excited to share the results of their new work with the group. And they give a little presentation showing the data and their interpretations from it. So the first step in the critical response process is that the advisor asks the group to contribute statements of meaning. This is what was interesting and exciting about the work, what was meaningful. I'm really asking the group to highlight the merits of the work. So someone might say, I was really impressed by the precision that you were able to extract from your new data. Next, in the next step, the presenter has the opportunity to ask questions of the audience. As the person who did the work, we all know where the weaknesses are, and we all know where we can most use feedback. So this provides the presenter the opportunity to have some agency, to have a moment to get that kind of feedback that they desire, and has an opportunity for the audience to provide that feedback. The third step in the critical response process is for the audience to ask neutral questions. And this is designed to have both the audience members gain more information before they might express an opinion about the material, And it allows the presenter to learn more insight about their own work. We all remember that instructor we had who asked really good questions that made us really think in a different way about our work. And the goal here is for the audience to be that person for the presenter. And then finally, the audience has the opportunity to share opinions about their work with the presenter in the structure of, I have an opinion about X, would you like to hear it? And by asking that question, it provides the presenter with some agency. They have the opportunity to say yes or to qualify their answer. So for example, yes, I would love to hear your feedback, but as long as it's restricted to the work that I presented today. So in this example, I've shown you a way that we can give feedback in the most constructive way possible. And to sort of formalize that, let's draw on a teaching tool here. I'd like to do a little exercise. So I'd like each of you to turn to your neighbor and maybe share a comment that you remember that was particularly painful that you've received. And then I'd like you to together come up with how you could frame it as a neutral question. And I provide a couple of strategies on the bottom here. So a not neutral question might be, why did you use so much red? In contrast to, tell me about your color choice. And then I would like you to think about how you can extract the subject matter. So in this case, color is the subject from that non-neutral question and turn it into a neutral question. And a good formula for that is, I'm curious about your thoughts on insert subject. So please turn to your neighbors and take a minute to discuss a non-neutral question that you've received. All right, take a second to wrap up. All right, let's come back together. Thank you for indulging me and participating in this activity. I hope that, if nothing else, you walk away from this discussion with a sense that when you see a presentation of someone's work, you have the opportunity to start with statements of meaning. And at nothing else, you have the opportunity to frame your questions as neutral questions, as a mechanism with which to enhance the constructiveness of the types of feedback that we give, and hopefully a means to make our communities more inclusive to all sorts of people. So today we've learned a little bit about how we can compare and contrast magmatic systems in some new and different ways. And we've learned about how we can use them to interrogate the processes that have happened at an individual volcano over time or between volcanoes, and how they could potentially be used as event trees for crustal and magmatic processes. And we can also think a little bit about the potential role of duration and flux in causing those sequences or families of magmatic processes. And if you're interested in talking to me more about magmatic trees or the critical response process, I hope you'll email me. My email address is up there. And I'd like to conclude today by asking that you only ask neutral questions at the end of the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christy, for this very inspiring talk. And I think, what you just said at the end is actually really important. So I think we have the opportunity now to put that into practice. So are there any neutral questions that you want to ask? We have quite a bit of time to share.
Christy, I had to ask a question. Thank you for that. That was incredible. Both sides of that talk were really amazing. And I think you really seem to have opened up a really new way for me, certainly, to think about volcanic processes and how you can combine them. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that sort of exercise. My first thought with the magmatic trees was event trees in volcanic hazard response. And I'm wondering if you see a connection between those two and, how we can use this information. Are there commonalities you can find in magmatic trees that link to the hazards we see?
Yeah, great. I really appreciate that question. Absolutely. I do think so. Hopefully many of us are familiar with the idea of event trees used for unrest at active volcanic systems. So this is the kind of thing like, is a dome growing, and is there a potential for a lahar or a pyroclastic flow, for example, and what is the probability of that based on past events of the system? And so those are speaking to these sort of syneruptive processes. And I can very easily imagine just stitching a crustal and mantle processes end onto those trees, where we have the mantle and crustal processes like I showed in the talk today with their probabilities, and then that feeding into the sort of syneruptive processes. And that there might be some insightful things, and we will learn whether or not there are controls of those crustal differentiation processes in informing those syneruptive processes by doing so. And I think that's an outstanding question, whether or not that will be useful, but we only know if we try. So thanks for that. Yeah.
Hi, Christy. I think it's very admirable how many regions of the transcrustal system you have studied. It's very fun to see all of that come together in these trees. And so I was curious a little bit about your thoughts on, Mount St. Helens. It's more eruptive. People flock to it to study it, right? So we have crazy amounts of data. Do you think some of that complexity that we're seeing, like all those boxes being ticked, is a little bit to do with that? And I know you've thought about statistics. So is there a statistical approach that we could think about? Is this more complex in nature just due to the number of eruptions that we see at that system?
Yeah, that's certainly important to think about, right? This is our observation bias, which we know we have. So I think there's two parts to how I want to respond to that. One is there's some of these processes and some of these systems that have been relatively well studied. And so for a sort of handful of systems or time periods at individual volcanoes, I think we have a good enough handle on the fact that these processes are, what they are and how they're occurring. So I think there's a few places where we have enough data to say, I'm confident in constructing the magmatic tree for this period of time at this volcano. But I also think that there's many, many volcanoes where we're lacking that degree of rigor. And in some recent papers by Penny Weiser, we actually document, the number of studies of, pyroxene compositions or experimental petrology studies on individual volcanoes, and show that the vast number of high threat and very high threat systems in the Cascades don't have that kind of level of detail. And so one, it's a call to arms, right? We can't construct the magmatic tree and know those probabilities unless we do more work, and we won't know. And what I'm showing you today is just what we can do with what we have currently. And so perhaps more work will upend that complete paradigm. And I threw it out today more as a desire to see us start to tackle that kind of question and think about these systems at that level, rather than saying, I've got it all figured out, right? So I think it's more of a driver for us to start thinking about how we can really kind of on a macro level think more about these systems. So thank you.
Christy, thank you for such a lovely presentation and a very clear one. I'm curious whether if you think there's a pathway to going from these trees to prioritizing what we monitor and measure at volcanoes, or changing how we monitor and study volcanoes in the Cascades.
Yeah, a really important question. I do. I mean, I think right now we have some very commonly collected data sets at our active systems. And we have the ones that we also want to collect, but, for a variety of reasons, like access issues, have been harder to collect so far. And so we're always up against practical realities in terms of what we can collect. But I do think that the more we start to link the full tree of processes to understanding volcanic unrest, the more it'll help guide us. Like, these are the things that are the most predictive, you know, these are the things that have been the most instructive. But if we only are looking at the syneruptive processes, we might be missing some of those signals. So I do think that there's, you know, some of those eruption initiation mechanisms have very discrete types of data tied to them. And the more we start to see, you know, what the, say, gas emission data is telling us about the eruption initiation event, the more we might start to see whether that's an important player in unrest and forecasting.
Christy, thanks for a great talk, very thought-provoking. I'd love to talk with you for a long time about a lot of things that you brought up. One question is thinking about the Cascades, and another thing that in the geophysics community we sort of more wondered about is tectonic setting and its influence, and particularly thinking about St. Helens being not where it's supposed to be relative to where magma is being created, and wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's really important. So when like we look at, you know, the basic large scale structural setting, we know that it's a little bit more compressive in the north part of the arc and a little bit more extensional or transtensional as we move to the southern portion of the arc. And on a cursory level or a first order level, Penny Weiser and Adam Kent and some of my colleagues, we've done a sort of survey of thermobarometry up and down the Cascades and asking the question, does that affect the storage of magmas, like the location of storage up and down? And what we see is that, as best as we can tell with thermobarometers right now, there's no difference in storage in results up and down the Cascades of that in particular structural setting. That's only one measure of how structural setting might affect it, but in that particular measure, there seems to be no first order effect. But I do think, you know, one of the things, right, about the location of Mount St. Helens is the Spirit Lake batholith and how magmas might be coming up around that. And perhaps one of the ways that we haven't thought about structural setting is that contribution of crustal melts and how prevalent it is or isn't in this system. And also the kind of like degree to which systems are forced to interact with the basement rocks or antecedent intrusions as they rise versus sort of an extensional environment where they might not have to interact with them as much and have easier pathways to the surface. So I don't think we've really explored sort of the structural setting in that kind of capacity, for example. So I think there's many other ways in which we can investigate it as a role in these types of families of processes. So yeah, thanks.
Hi, thank you very much for such an inspiring talk. And I had a few questions related about the widespread acquisition of these event trees and how widespread they are right now and how you would hope they will be adopted in the future. At the same time, if you'd add any changes to those event trees for older magmatic events, for example, Archean or Proterozoic events, would you add up changes because of our confidence in the mental processes at that time, or way weaker than the one we have now?
Right. Yeah, that's a great, I mean, I have just, as you could see on some of those, there's a paper that's coming out in Volcanica right now where I propose magmatic trees and start to apply them. But that's the tip of the iceberg, right? So I certainly haven't thought back in time and looked at other systems yet. And the whole goal of these trees is that they're readily adaptable. They have a core essential structure, like I've proposed, that like an undergraduate level petrologist could fill out. And that's to facilitate comparison against basically any igneous rock. But we can add more processes, especially say that they might be relevant at different time periods, or adapt them in ways that they need to be adapted to investigate different questions, add complexity to them. And I think that looking at trees extending both back in time or adding different processes to the tree is going to be useful. So I hope you'll do that. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Christy. That was a great talk as always. I love these magmatic trees and found especially fascinating these moments where you can say, oh, this tree matches another tree that must be similar sort of processes. But then when you get into really complex volcanic behavior where either different studies or your own study shows multiple different processes within one given layer of that tree, how do you suggest going about kind of assigning multiple processes within that tree so that you don't, I'm a habitual splitter rather than lumper. And I fear, when there's multiple processes, how do you go about representing that in this tree without making it so that they either have all processes or none of them are similar to each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of like practical ways that we need to like investigate using these trees. And that's an important question that's come up several times as I've talked about them with colleagues so far. I think that what I'm striving after in the way I presented them today is this sort of highest level question that I was talking about. Like, is a process one of the key contributing factors to generating this rock? So if we went back to those networks of causal influences and medical and insurance work, right, where it was like, these are the processes that contributed to this food shortage, right? We're not going to be able to capture every tiny little thing, but what were the macro level things? And so I've been thinking about it so far as like, what were the key players in contributing to this rock? Because I think that then facilitates these like high level comparisons. But that's not the only way you can use it. And I actually, by sort of like giving this over to everybody now, look forward to all the ways that you're going to show me how to better use the tree. So I look forward for you showing me next time how I can better use the tree. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Christy. If there are no other pressing questions, I'd like to thank again Christy for this very inspiring talk. And thank you everyone for having attended the Daly Lecture 2024.